So this is what I feel like I'm going to get on by the end of quarantine, is everybody's nerves. Um, I really wanted to talk about something that I actually find incredibly fascinating, and that's something called the central nervous system and how it's really linked into what we do as chiropractors. So essentially what we know is there are several billion nerve cells within the body, and again multiples of billions of connections between those cells, all talking to each other, that basically send signals from our brain down through our spinal cord and out into the periphery to either our muscles, our skin, or our organs. Now, what we've got to essentially understand is that when we think about nerves, there are three different areas of nerve function, and they all serve a different purpose. Now, if we damage our nerve system, then we can start to get different problems start to arise. So depending on which nerves we start to damage is going to depend on what kind of a symptom that we get. So in order to understand what's going to happen, we actually need to understand the three different areas. Now, of those areas, like I say, depending on what happens, is going to depend on the outcome of what we receive. So the first one, which I think probably most people come and see chiropractors for, is something called sensory. Now, sensory could be anything to do with general sensation. It could be to do with vibration, or it could be something to do with pain. Now, pain is probably the most common sense or change in senses that occur as a result of people walking into a chiropractor's door, or potentially any therapist's door. And the reason being is that for us to feel pain, something has to have happened within our system to have been damaged to trigger the nerves to create pain. So whether that's actually a neurological problem, which can be affected either physically, we can physically affect our nerve endings. Let's say, for example, if we have a fall, we're automatically going to feel those nerve endings fire up. We can affect them chemically by the foods and stuff that we put into our body. Actually, alcoholism massively can affect the sensory nerves, and actually you get something called glove stocking syndrome, which is where you get pins and needles both your hands and your feet, because the alcoholism actually damages the nerve endings. This also happens in diabetes as well, following a relatively similar process. And then you can also get it mentally. Now, our emotions massively will affect the way that we feel. So this is sometimes one of the reasons, or one of the arguments into something like chronic fatigue or fibromyalgia. In certain cases, they believe that there's actually been an emotional trauma that's actually triggered pain as a result. So that's number one. Now, number two is something we call our motor system. And our motor system is essentially all of the stuff that helps us to control movement. So essentially this sends all the signals to our skeletal muscles and ligaments, and allows us to propriocept and move properly. So say for example, if I want to move my hand, a signal has got to come from my brain down through my spinal cord, down my arm, and through to the multiples. So depending on which fingers that I want to use is going to depend on which muscles that I'm going to work, and it's also going to depend on which nerve roots get fired up in order to actually move those. Now, what we'll generally see is if we compress a motor part of a nerve, we'll start to see weakness start to occur, or completely the opposite. We'll see something called spasticity, which is where you either have too much or too little activation in a muscle. So again, if we start to compress, this is why, say for example, with something like sciatica, it's very common for someone to have that shooting pains down into the leg, but then they're also very likely to have weakness or the leg giving way, because they've both got a sensory compression and a motor compression. Now, the last one, this is sometimes the one that we kind of forget about, and it's probably one of the most important ones, because it's the one that's keeping us alive, and this is called our autonomic nervous system. Now, our autonomic nervous system is essentially all the stuff that's going on in the background. So this is your organs, your heart, your stomach, your liver, your kidneys. They all receive information from the brain through the spinal cord to tell them whether to increase or decrease on function. So say, for example, if all of a sudden you start doing exercise, your heart rate will need to increase. Now, it's that signal from the brain that tells the heart to increase. Now, say, for example, if we increase our activity levels, but our heart rate cannot keep up, all of a sudden this can start to have an impact because our blood will not be pumping around to the muscles quick enough, and our muscles will fatigue, and we just won't be able to keep that process or sustain that level of activity. Again, damages to the autonomic system can obviously result in organs functioning too high or too low. And so if, say, for example, we had an issue and we go back to the sciatica issue, if you go one step further than the sciatica, you can get the sensory loss, the weakness in the legs. But actually, in certain instances, we'll also start to have problems with the bowel or the bladder. And essentially, what's basically been compressed in that nerve root is areas from all three. And if all three areas have then been compressed, then that's what we call a cauda equina syndrome. And it can actually start to cause not only the motor and sensory losses, but like I say, organ losses as well. And generally, as a rule of thumb, this will be controlled to our bowels and our bladder. So again, you may think that chiropractic is really about treating pain or treating like certain functional conditions, but actually what we've basically started to see is that people generally will improve in all three areas when they get adjusted longer term, okay? And the reason we know that is actually when we start to adjust the spine, it actually improves the function of the nerves and therefore the signal going to the brain. And by the brain improving its signal, it can actually start to send better messages itself as well. I hope you found this topic helpful. If you've got any questions surrounding it, please just comment below, or equally, you can either give us a phone call in the clinic, and someone will hopefully be able to go through this with you in a little bit more detail, one of our practitioners.